Today, we're diving deep into one of the 20th century's most defining moments. We're talking about how a set of really powerful ideas, mixed with a truly disastrous war, led to the total collapse of one of the biggest empires on Earth. This is the story of the Russian Revolution, an event that promised a perfect world and ended up changing everything. So here's how we're going to break this incredible story down. First, we'll look at the revolutionary ideas that were already buzzing around Europe. Then we'll zoom right into Russia, a country that was, well, on the verge of exploding. We'll walk through the actual revolutions of 1917, see how Lenin and the Bolsheviks grabbed power, and then we'll wrap up by looking at how this one event echoed across the entire globe. Okay, let's get right into it. Because before a single shot was fired in Russia, there was another kind of revolution happening all over Europe. A revolution of ideas that challenged literally everything people thought they knew about how society should work. And if you want to find the real spark for all this, you've got to go back to the French Revolution. That event sent a shockwave across the continent. Why? Because it proved one massive thing. The old world of kings and aristocrats wasn't permanent. It could be questioned, it could be fought, and it could be totally torn down. So in the wake of all that, politics pretty much split into three big groups. First, you had the liberals. They wanted some changes, like elected parliaments, but they were a bit nervous about giving everyone the right to vote. Then you had the radicals, who went further. They wanted a government run by the majority of the people. And then, of course, you had the conservatives. They basically wanted to hit the brakes, admitting that some change had to happen, but they wanted it to be as slow as possible. But here's where it gets really interesting. A new, much more extreme idea started to gain traction: socialism. And this wasn't just about tinkering with the government. This was about completely redesigning the entire economic and social engine of society. See, at its heart, socialism looked at the idea of private property, one person owning a factory or a huge piece of land, and said, that's the root of the problem. Socialists argued that owners only cared about their own profit, not about the workers who actually created the wealth. Their solution? Take property out of private hands and have society as a whole control it for the good of absolutely everyone. So you have all these new, radical ideas swirling around Europe. But what was going on in Russia? Well, to put it mildly, the Russian Empire was a different beast altogether. It was a huge, unstable powder keg, and someone was about to light the fuse. And this number right here tells you almost everything you need to know. While Western Europe was industrializing, Russia was still overwhelmingly a nation of peasants. A staggering 85% of its people lived and worked on the land. That's a way higher number than in places like France or Germany. And who ruled this massive empire? The Tsar. He was an autocrat, which is just a fancy word for someone with absolute total power. There was no real parliament to keep him in check. While the rest of Europe was inching towards democracy, Russia was like a relic from a much older time. Well, all that tension finally exploded in 1905. The economy was a mess, and massive strikes broke out. When a peaceful crowd of workers marched to the Tsar's palace, what happened? The troops opened fire. They killed over 100 people. That day became infamous as Bloody Sunday. This act of violence sparked an uprising across the country, and it actually forced the Tsar to create a parliament called the Duma. But he got rid of it as soon as he could, proving he had zero interest in actually sharing power. You could think of 1905 as a dress rehearsal. The main event, the thing that finally pushed the entire system over the cliff, came a decade later, and its name was World War I. Russia had the biggest army in the world, nicknamed the Russian Steamroller. And at first, the war was actually pretty popular. But as the fighting dragged on and the losses piled up, that all changed. You have to understand, the Tsar's entire power rested on the loyalty of this massive army, and that loyalty was starting to shatter. I mean, the war was a total catastrophe for Russia. By 1917, over 7 million casualties. The country's infrastructure just fell apart. There were massive food shortages in the cities, leading to riots, and the army itself, it was just done. Badly supplied, badly led, they had lost the will to fight. The country was literally breaking down. So in the freezing cold of February 1917, it all just boiled over in the capital city, Petrograd. It started with women workers from a factory going on strike, demanding bread. But it just snowballed from there. More and more people joined in. And then came the moment that changed everything. Soldiers were ordered to shoot the protesters, but instead they mutinied and joined them. Within a few days, the city belonged to the revolution. The Tsar's own generals told him it was over. He abdicated, and just like that, 300 years of Romanov rule vanished. So the Tsar is gone. Now what? You've got this huge power vacuum. On one side, a group of politicians formed a liberal provisional government. But at the exact same time, the workers and soldiers who'd actually made the revolution happen formed their own councils called Soviets. And the Petrograd Soviet in the capital was incredibly powerful. So you've got this weird situation with two governments basically competing for control. It was not a recipe for stability. And into this total chaos steps one of history's most focused and ruthless revolutionaries, Vladimir Lenin. He and his radical Bolshevik party saw this power struggle not as a crisis, but as the perfect opportunity. Lenin had been living in exile, but he rushed back to Russia in April 1917 with a very clear, very radical plan. He demanded three simple things: stop the war now, give all the land to the peasants, and take over the banks. His slogans were punchy and powerful: peace, land, and bread. For a country sick of war and starvation, this message hit home hard. And this is the huge difference between the two revolutions in 1917. February was spontaneous, a popular explosion of anger. But October? Oh, October was a plan. It was a calculated, organized seizure of power. Lenin convinced the Bolsheviks the time was right to strike. On October 24th, led by Leon Trotsky, armed workers and soldiers systematically took control of all the key buildings in the city. It was a swift, efficient coup, and by the end of the day, the provisional government was history. Okay, so taking power is one thing, but holding on to it and actually building a brand new world, that's a whole other ballgame. Now that they were in charge, the Bolsheviks began the radical, brutal work of turning Russia into the world's very first socialist state. And they did not waste any time. The changes were immediate and they were sweeping. They nationalized all the big industries and banks. They declared all land to be social property, which basically just made it official for the peasants to seize the nobles' estates. They got rid of all the old aristocratic titles, and pretty soon they renamed their party the Communist Party and made it clear Russia was now a one-party state. Now, you can't make changes that radical without a massive fight. For the next 3 years, a horribly brutal civil war tore Russia apart. On one side, you had the Bolsheviks, the Reds. On the other, you had a messy coalition of opponents called the Whites, which included everyone from supporters of the Tsar to other rival socialists called the Greens. The Whites were even backed by foreign countries like Britain and the US, who were terrified of communism spreading. But in the end, it was the Reds who won. But here's the thing. The Russian Revolution wasn't just an event that happened in Russia. By creating the first ever socialist state, it sent shockwaves across the entire planet. And honestly, we're still feeling the tremors today. And this quote just perfectly captures the complicated legacy, right? On the one hand, the Soviet Union transformed a poor peasant nation into a global superpower. It fed people, it inspired movements all over the world. But all of that progress came at a horrifying price. It was built on the denial of basic human freedoms and used incredibly brutal methods to stay in power. And that leaves us with this huge final question. The revolution started with these incredible promises: peace, land, bread, a world without oppression. But its journey was paved with civil war, dictatorship, and the crushing of freedom. So how do we make sense of that today? Understanding this complex legacy, both the dream and the nightmare, is absolutely key to understanding the 20th century and the world we all live in right now.